Here's what I want to try and do. I'm going to talk a little bit differently than Richard in the sense that I'd like to explore with you what we mean by deep tech, why it matters, and ideally why Singapore is in a position to do something important in this regard, and AI will be one of those subsets. So let me jump straight in. What is deep tech? We define it at SGInnovate as something that has a scientific core. There isn't any magic definition that said it must be AI or autonomous vehicles. So we start with, is there a high barrier to entry? Is there something that's difficult for people to replicate? Another way of thinking of it, to use an MIT type of expression, founded in a lab, not in a dormitory. So these things that are higher and more complicated. Deep tech, though, I would argue, has made all of this possible. Everybody here is a function of advances in deep tech. Without antibiotics, without skyscrapers, which is a function of technology, we'd be living much closer to where we work. Without trains, internet, which was obviously the precursor, was the telegraph. All these things that have shaped human civilization and where we are, even lifespans and how we go forward, is a function of deep tech. So what I'd like to do is stress that it matters. I'm also going to use this as a chance to plug one of my pet peeves, which is there has been one moonshot in human history, and not every corporate initiative that we think of before lunchtime should be called a moonshot. So when people say, let's come up with 3 moonshots before we take a break, please can we think about moonshot as something that was hundreds of billions of dollars, people's lives, huge advances in areas that people knew nothing about, and that was what caused a lot of humanity around the world to rally to what we now refer to 50 years later as a moonshot. Here's some of the challenges we're facing. Without deep tech, I would argue, we have some very significant, even unsolvable problems. So I won't list all of these, but you know that we have real issues around food allocation, water scarcity. I mean, Jakarta is sinking because of the groundwater being removed. So there are a lot of very significant human problems. And I would argue that deep tech is something that we need to rally behind in terms of investing in and supporting, because we need answers. Let me illustrate the scale of what's happening. Now, don't be distracted by the numbers. These are just sort of moments in time taken every 3 years by Department of Statistics here in Singapore. There is a growth in the number of startups, so that's a good thing. My team and I and lots of other parts of Singapore and the Singapore government work on this, so we're all excited. But what I'd like to illustrate is that deep tech continues to be a fractional part of what's happening. I would argue, and I'll be controversial in case our friend Jonathan would like to pick up on any of these things, the world doesn't move forward based on another and another and another restaurant booking system or bicycle sharing app, even while we have some very significant problems. So convenience is great, but we need to also think about the really tough stuff that means we will or won't be here in 50 years. And right now, deep tech is an area that is growing, but still a fractional piece. Why? Pretty obvious. If you're an LP or if you're a limited partner in an investment fund, you have 3 things that you want to accomplish. You want the highest return for the lowest amount of risk in the shortest amount of time. And none of those are explained by deep tech. Deep tech is hard, it's complicated, tends to be capital intensive, tends to be harder to adopt. I would argue it's important, but it's not as easy as building something in another part of the technology industry. So that's why we exist. That's why we set up SGInnovate 3 years ago. Wholly owned by Singapore government, so we act in this sort of 2 worlds at the same time. We are a private limited company by structure. We have the Ministry of Finance as our one investor. We sit in PMO, we're linked to NRF for anybody that's interested in the construct. Our only mission is to be of value and use to entrepreneurial scientists. So not every scientist wants to be entrepreneurial, and not every entrepreneur is scientific, but where we have that intersection, we want to be useful. So we think of things like raising investment capital, helping find great teammates, helping find early adopters. Those are complex issues when you're talking about computer vision in healthcare. That's different as a hiring profile than some of the other technology needs. Richard touched on some of the needs and the skills. If you take things like computer vision and a domain, That's a very small pool of individuals. So we need to think about these things, and that's part of what we do. We build companies, and we believe that by building companies and communities, an ecosystem emerges. We do not believe in trying to create an ecosystem and hope that companies rise from it. So we tend to start from let's build great companies and great communities, and then an ecosystem is what happens. That is the genesis of the thing we call Silicon Valley. Great companies like Fairchild, and then Stanford said, how do I produce more great men and women for companies like Fairchild, and then on it goes. Okay, 2 deep tech companies that are building for humanity. Both of these are SGInnovate portfolios, so in the spirit of disclosure, I'm just here to describe what they do and why we believe in them. Both were founded in Singapore, and we think that matters. I think they're good illustrations. NDR, thinking about medicine in terms of combining robotics and AI. How can a clinician better find the insertion point and angle and depth for a needle to biopsy a concerning area, a lesion? So today, with live images, surgeon tries to figure it out and then makes that insertion. These 2 founders have used robotics and different images, so CTs, MRIs, to try and help better improve the angle of attack. The moment of insertion is still the clinician, so back to the point that this does not replace the doctor, but this assists the doctor to be at a superior level of performance than he or she might otherwise be. Founded, born, raised as an early stage company in Singapore. C-Mode, working on helping increase the predictability of stroke. Again, when you go to hospital, you have a CT and MRI if you have a certain set of symptoms. So these are not new images that have to be gathered. These are already in the workflow, which is why this adoption is very significant. It makes it easy for hospitals and clinicians to adopt it. So C-Mode takes existing image information and combines hemodynamic modeling, which is blood flow modeling, to try and understand the flow of blood within the arteries and where plaque exists that creates friction that makes the possibility of a clot greater. Again, founded in Singapore, 2 NTU grads, building, worked with lots of different hospitals here in a prototype. Currently in Australia, working in some hospitals. Why? Because for better or worse, the reality is that some of the hospitals in Australia have been more open and more comfortable to utilize data to try and drive experimentation and adoption. And like any great entrepreneur, you go to where the opportunity is. So we were very conflicted emotionally, which is as an investor and as a cheerleader for them, we said, go where the opportunity is. I also gave very direct feedback to some senior government leaders saying, if we don't fix these things here, we will build great companies and they will grow somewhere else. So I think this is an important thing for us to be very open and honest with each other about. Here's the question that I'd like to pose for our discussion in our panel. I'm not especially thinking about how we can use AI to reduce OpEx or how we can drive revenue, although those are important things for a company. But companies have the capability to think about those issues with help from Microsoft and many others. What I would like for us to continue to discuss is what do we expect of AI as humans, as humanity? How do we want to use data? Do we want to make data available when it suits us for purposes of convenience? The answer is yes. We do that today for Lazada and Amazon and anyone else. When it comes to sharing medical records, half the room will always reduce and drop their hand down. Every time I ask a room full of people, would you share medical information in pursuit of improvement in diagnostics and treatment? Even if we can say to you, don't worry about privacy and anonymity, we can guarantee it, still, half the room drops their hand down. So when we think about AI, I come from the school that says inevitable, we ought to embrace it. We have too many problems to solve not to do that. And so now what we need to do is think about what does privacy mean? What are the rules around liability? Who is accountable for an autonomous vehicle running off the road? All good questions. My point isn't that those questions don't exist. It's let's discuss them and tackle them. in the same way that we've had to think of safety belts and airbags and anti-lock brakes when we put vehicles on the road and then discover that it didn't work in the way that we would have hoped. So I'm on the side of we need to embrace AI in order to tackle tough problems. But let's think about it from the big picture level and not so much from the business productivity level. That's for all of the business leaders to think about. What do we want as people, as humans? So I'd love to continue the dialogue. I know we want to get straight into it. So if you want to continue the dialogue, this is how to reach me, and I'd love to carry on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.